Welcome to Tech on Reg, the podcast that explores all things at the intersection of law, technology, and high-regulated industry. We're talking fintech, regtech, sextech, and more with thought leaders and entrepreneurs from around the world to share insights, trade viewpoints, and get us all thinking about responsible innovation. And here is your host, Dara.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to what is now the last episode of Tech on Reg for the year 2020. And what a monumental year it has been. Today with us, we're doing sort of a 2020 Regulatory Roundup year in review with some really awesome guests. First, we've got Joann Barefoot, the CEO and founder of AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, co-founder of Hummingbird RegTech, and also a former deputy comptroller of the currency. And we also have with us Jason Henrichs, co-host of Breaking Banks US, CEO of the Alloy Labs Alliance, co-founder of FinTech Forge, VC, super awesome guy, and my dear friend.
And person who likes to drone on and on about regulation while his 4-year-old wanders away, not caring what the latest, issuance from the Office of the Comptroller of Currency said.
Well, the girls will get on board at some point, but because of Jason's love for regulatory nerd talk, hence why he and I have become such close friends, amongst other reasons. So Joann, Jason, really psyched to have you here. It's been an insane year on so many levels. Sort of talking about the insanity of the regulation seems almost like tertiary, right? Like it's just sort of like off here that, we've been so focused on the nuts and bolts of getting through 2020. And there have been so many things that have dominated industry's priorities right now that I think sometimes this year, focus on the regulatory impact of this year hasn't really been front and center. I don't know if you guys have sort of felt the same thing.
Obviously, COVID has dominated everything, but I think in the regulatory arena, the biggest impact from COVID has been the acceleration of technology adoption, both in the industry and by regulators themselves. I feel like we've packed a decade's worth of tech adoption and innovation into a few months this year. So the financial activities have gotten driven into online and digital channels, just like everything else has. And the regulators have done the same. They've figured out how to work from home. They figured out how to collect information differently. They've accelerated projects like digital regulatory reporting. So I don't think we're ever going back from most of this, except at the margin. So I think we're going to land in 2021 with a whole lot more focus on everything that is digital, both in the industry and for the regulators.
Completely agree with that, Joann. And the question I have is, so we went from this stance of we can't to we must, right? Especially things like work from home and cloud and all of these pieces. The question is there going to be a move that we want to slow down? Like it was all too much. Is there going to be, we're going to ring in 2021 with a giant COVID hangover around digital transformation. People are going to try and revert. Or now that we've actually broken up the scar tissue, are we going to be able to maintain the momentum? And I hope it's the latter. And reasonably, what are your thoughts?
So I've been thinking about this a lot. And strangely enough, I think there might be a difference between acceleration of reg tech and supervisory tech versus fintech. On the reg tech side, I think it's full speed ahead. I talked to a senior regulator recently who said that the last crisis froze up innovation, paralyzed it. Nothing happened for years after that, whereas this one is accelerating it. And I don't think we're going back from that in terms of the regulators' interests, although we'll talk in a moment about their shifting priorities with a new administration and a new Congress coming in. On fintech, though, well, speaking of a new administration and Congress, I think that there's I don't think it's just COVID fatigue or slowing down. I think there's a lot of skepticism about the value of fintech benefiting consumers. We're seeing this from the leaders in Congress. We're seeing it from some of the transition team members. And I think that it's a mistake for the fintech world to feel complacent, that everybody knows that fintechs are good guys and are trying to do the right thing and trying to make things better for consumers. There's a lot of deep skepticism that innovation is not necessarily a good thing, that it can mask predatory practices, that some of it is an attempt to get around usury laws. I think fintech is really going to have a year of make or break in a lot of ways from a policy regulatory standpoint.
All right, Jason, I know you have 87 things to say about that. The new administration, hearing from Joann that the rumblings we're hearing from a new administration is that, innovation in fintech is masking otherwise bad practices that, we don't want. Those are the same arguments we've been hearing on the state level against the notions of innovation sandboxes. And, we've been hearing that for a while, right? Those sentiments don't feel new to me, but maybe now, are we moving backwards? What do you think, Jason?
Well, I worry that one of the biggest things that we've labeled as innovation, it might not have been intentional on the part of the startups, but where they see an unmet need are people that really, especially on the lending side, are people who shouldn't actually potentially be taking on more debt. And just going deeper into, the credit stack, in my mind, is not actually all that innovative. It's just being masked by, the pretty flow and the fact that you can do it all online, and changes to some of the ways and the frequency with which you repay. And that's where I think we're going to need to see a lot of reconciliation in the coming year, where people didn't fully understand, or due to COVID and other things, they had to dip into the stack. They're dancing with the devil in doing it, but that isn't real innovation.
So I agree. Could I just jump in on that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I agree with that, but I'll add 2 points to it. One is that we're on the cusp of a real breakthrough in how to do credit underwriting in a smarter way, which is not about making loans to people who can't repay them. It's about making loans to people who can repay them, but we can't tell that using the traditional credit scoring and credit history tools that we've had, which are old, not to take away from the traditional credit bureaus. They're innovating too. But I chair the board of FinReg Lab, for example, and we've done research finding that if you use cash flow underwriting instead of just traditional credit underwriting, you can say yes to a lot of people who are credit worthy, but who have been excluded, not because they can't repay the loan, but because the lender can't easily tell. And so they just say no to them or charge them more. And the other is the online lending model itself, the efficiency of it. Granted, there are lots of issues with it. Some models are abusive. There are, problems with higher fraud and so on. But the fact remains, it's so much less expensive to serve people that way. If we look at the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program numbers, when the fintech lenders were allowed into that after it had already gotten started, and this was the first time they were allowed into SBA programs, they performed really well in meeting the needs of very small businesses, 1 to 10 employees, which are have the hardest time getting bank financing. They're disproportionately owned by women and people of color. And just the efficiency of that business model is a big boon, in my view, to financial inclusion. And it may or may not have the full enthusiasm of the new leadership in Washington.
So here to the use of alternative data and the leveraging of technology to more efficiently serve, traditionally underserved populations and small businesses. So when we talk about alternative data, right, Joann, is that one of the data-driven trends that you hope will gain more focus, in 2021? I think that the skepticism around the types of things that are going to open up access to credit and banking services to these populations, the fact that it's met with skepticism by the incoming administration is so, ironic, right? Isn't that so ironic? Anyone can jump in here. It's sort of like, it's a head scratcher for me.
I mean, I have spent my career working on financial consumer protection and inclusion. And the epiphany that I had 6 or 7 years ago was that we have been trying to accomplish inclusion and protection through regulation forever, for like a half a century, if you start with the Truth in Lending Act. And that we can do better through technology on a lot of these goals if we regulate it in the right way. So it would be ironic and unfortunate if there was part of this overall technology backlash that we seem to be involved in, if people shut down some of these innovations before they really took a good hard look at all the good that they can do, even though there are risks connected with them.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that I am hopeful for with better data, better analysis, that instead of trying to avoid all risk because we really have a problem scoping it, right? And so we try and make it very black and white, that data and greater adaptability will enable, risks that are risks worth taking, right? Like rethinking underwriting standards, to do things to be more inclusive and seeing what happens before, kind of turning it up. And this, really goes back, Dara, to something you and I talk quite a bit about around sandboxes, the idea of can we do test and learn as it relates to, regulation.
Jason, I think you and I should rename sandboxes because sandboxes is it's like a dirty word now. I think we should just call them labs. I think we should just call them regulatory labs. It sounds much more official and scientific. What do you say?
Yes, labs, you're wearing white coats, safety glasses.
100%.
No one goes into the lab with the intent of blowing it up. It might happen.
It's all about the messaging.
Yeah, it's all about the messaging.
But I will say we have sandboxes now all over the world. The United States is an outlier in being uncomfortable with sandboxes. I mean, there's just so much adoption.
Save, except for a handful of states we can query how effective those sandboxes have been, which doesn't do much for our cause, but that's the subject of another episode. All right. So let's talk about the CFPB. They've had an interesting year that sort of got busy towards the end, up into the election cycle. And it's gotten even busier. I suspect that momentum is not going to stop come 2021. But Joann, I wanted to get some insight and thoughts from you about what we think the new director might look like.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I think that the financial regulatory agency heads in general are going to look different because I think they are going to be much, much more diverse than what we have had in the past. I think there's a real commitment to this. You may know the work of Chris Brimmer at Georgetown Law School, researching the fact that we have had no Black financial agency regulatory heads at the federal level, at least since the Great Depression, with the exception currently of Rodney Hood, who chairs the National Credit Union Administration. Zero. We've had Black board members, but not heading these agencies. I think there's going to be a tremendous focus on diversity, and there's also going to be a tremendous focus on racial equity issues all across the board in everything we're talking about. The killing of George Floyd is still very much top of mind. For complicated reasons, it wasn't an issue that blew over and people went back to where they were before. I think it really moved people into a sustained focus. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing, and I think you're alluding to it, Dara, is that we should expect a really energized enforcement agenda. The CFPB has been noticeably active lately with its enforcement activities, but I think we're likely to have somebody who will really bring an aggressive posture on enforcement.
I don't know. I think I really noticed an uptick, starting in August. It was in a few months leading up before the election. All of a sudden, we started seeing press releases and announcements coming out of the agency that had been quite sleepy. the 3 years prior. Like there was,
I was going to say not just sleepy the beginning of the year, but like sleepy for 3.5 years.
Oh yeah. I mean, and we had, it was, a round robin of interim directors and, there was sort of a general lack of focus, things that I had on the agenda, like all of a sudden I would stop hearing about, and there was still some rulemaking activity happening. But in terms of enforcement and supervision felt slower. Enforcement felt real sleepy. And it felt like all of a sudden in the months leading up towards the election, it was like, okay, we got to do stuff. Like, I don't know what memo got, I'm not privy. I don't know what memo got circulated, but it definitely, all of a sudden in August picked up, and it has not slowed down. I'm sort of curious from a budgeting standpoint, whether or not we're going to see more enforcement attorneys being hired and what sort of additional resources we're going to see there, because we hadn't seen it the past 3 years. So I'm wondering if we're going to harken back to a Cordray era CFPB sort of approach.
I wouldn't be surprised. Rich Cordray was the Attorney General of Ohio and had an enforcement background. So I would think we'll see more enforcement lawyers, a very active enforcement agenda and a rulemaking agenda as well. As you say, they've got some important things in the pipeline.
As it relates to the enforcement actions, one of the things I would love to see here, that how the FCA set up their Office of Innovation in their sandbox, I think is so important, is this idea of conveying intent. Not that it's you can just say, hey, as long as your intent was good, if you go off and what you did turns out to be bad, you're off the hook. But I would love to see kind of both the stick and the carrot attached here, in terms of the stick being, hey, enforcement is going to go up. But as long as you can show like your intent, and there was a good intent for the customers, especially consumers that you were trying to innovate for, you do get some leniency. And like the whole paradigm there is just so much more modern, as opposed to right now. It feels like we're caught in these pendulum swings of, hey, we need to pull back and just let industry do its thing, to the no, we need to go punish any wrongdoing, real or perceived. That the swings, I think the group that's getting hurt is probably the marginalized ones in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. Joann, I'm sort of curious as to what you think the CFPB's Office of Innovation is really going to look like in a Biden administration.
Well, I hope it's going to be very active. I hope all of the agencies' innovation programs will be gaining momentum. And to the point that you just made, Jason, one of the things that people need to be mindful of is that the compliance tools are improving through RegTech and through some of the fintech changes. And one thing the regulators should be careful of is that if say a bank is thinking about adopting a better tool for looking for money laundering, for example, yep, they worry about the fact that they may find out that there was a whole lot of money laundering going on before that their older tool didn't find. And they don't want to be punished for that. As you say, Jason, if they had the good intent and they were using the state-of-the-art method, but they're a little afraid of turning that rock over for fear that there could be a regulatory repercussion of that. This is going to be the life we're going to be in now, as far into the future as we can see. The data is increasing, the AI is increasing, and the tools are going to get better and better to find discrimination, to find money laundering, to find unfair and deceptive practices, you name it. And the regulators should welcome the use of these better tools and not punish old behavior that that was maybe the best that could be done at the time.
So I'd love to talk about some of this technology, right? So we see a massively increased adoption in AI-driven tools across a variety of platforms, and RegTech certainly included in that. What's our sense about whether or not our regulators, sort of across the board, the banking regulators, the consumer regulators, the SEC, the FTC, are they equipped with the right information and expertise to supervise and, audit the use of these tools properly so you don't run into a situation like you just described. Like, are they armed with the right information and resources to be able to accurately assess whether or not these tools are actually good for the industry?
Yeah, I would say the bad news is they are not equipped, but the good news is they realize this and they're really working on how to be collaborative with the private sector as well, and to figure out, I think a lot of them are very focused. I am extremely optimistic about the trend on the regulators. We work with them all the time in the United States and all over the world. I'm a former bank regulator myself, and there has been such an embrace of technology and innovation, and such a move toward innovation that a few years back would have taken courage to try. There's much more readiness by regulators to try things. The CFPB just put on their tech sprint a month or two ago. I mean, that was a really important undertaking. The U.S. Treasury is planning a tech sprint on financial crime. Some of the other agencies have them on the drawing board as well. So the trend line has been really positive, but they do need to do rapid learning, rapid clarification of standards for things, especially like using AI. That's probably the hardest one. And the hard questions of how are we going to permit data to be used? How are we going to figure out the privacy issues vis-a-vis the benefits of using data in new ways? These are tough issues, and the regulators are going to have to scramble to get on top.
Yeah, I see lots of revisions to protocols of those supervisory manuals happening in the near future to account for so much of this, which, when these were originally drafted, they didn't have these questions to ask, quite frankly.
Well, and I think one of the places that technology, and I think COVID has been good and hopefully will drive some change, is even how we think about structuring the agencies themselves. That can we centralize some of this expertise? And because, hey, we've proven you can actually go do a bank exam without hunkering down in their conference room for 4 weeks. So can we do it more continuously, and by getting the expertise that's centralized around AI? Do you end up with that AI SWAT team that you don't expect every examiner in the field to be able to deal with that? Let alone, imagine them interacting now with some of the hotshot startups that are out there, pulling some of the best minds out of the Googles and the Amazons and academia to go do hotshot AI things, right? Imagine that field examiner, deer in headlights. The answer will always be no. So, can you build some of those hotshots?
It's easier, right? It's easier to say no.
In a centralized location. Yeah.
I think that's a great point. There's a lot of pressures on regulatory structure, and I've been in and around Washington long enough that I'm doubtful that we'll be doing much actual restructuring of agencies unless there are even more crises upon us. But we do need new models, and we kind of think of it as creating connective tissue among these agencies without changing their official setups. And a big example of this, if I'm making predictions for next year, I'm going to say again this year what I said last year when people asked me for predictions, which is cryptocurrency is going mainstream really fast. It creates all kinds of structural and mold breaking challenges for regulators. And the same is true of central bank digital currency, CBDC. The United States is not going to be first because China's already got an EU on in some of the marketplace. And I think over 30 countries are working on this. But we are in robust conversations about a digital dollar. A digital dollar is going to bring programmable money. These are really different challenges, and the tech is coming fast, and it's tied up in many cases with geopolitical, winds of change. And our regulators are really going to have to scramble. And so many of these things, you don't even know what law, if any, applies to it, what agency has the lead role. We got a lot of change ahead.
And that's how all of Dara's kids are going to be sent to college.
Exactly.
So thanks. Thank you for that. But so given everything you just said, Joann, that sort of brings another issue that we glanced over at the beginning, but that is security and privacy, data security, data privacy, and cyber, which now with the massive and rapid move towards digital everything, the way bank exams are going to be conducted, the way businesses are doing business now, the way financial institutions and those that service financial institutions are interacting with end customers, everything changed in 2020. Where we were when we were communicating, how we were communicating, using AI to communicate. Again, what I forget Joann or Jason who said it, but we took 10 years and shoved it into a few months. All of that makes these cybersecurity and privacy questions percolate right up to the top. And as of right now, we still, have no one federal agency that is, our privacy and security go-to. States have been doing this on their own, some in more robust ways than others. But nonetheless, I don't think that there's any state that hasn't considered some state level privacy and security protocols. Obviously California, New York, Illinois with their biometric acts, they've sort of been front and center on these issues. And I know, Joann, you were mentioning previously that we've had some bills sitting on the House floor for quite some time. Do you think that in a Biden administration, we are going to see a federal privacy regulator?
A couple of months ago, I was predicting that if we had a sweep of the Democrats, White House, and Senate, that we could see the whole issue of privacy really move fast, which people aren't ready for because at the federal level, it's been sort of stuck for a long time. Lots of smaller issues getting, sub-issues getting debated. Assuming that the Republicans keep the Senate, I think it won't be fast. And do I think we'll have a separate agency? I'm kind of skeptical of that. But I do think there's going to be a concerted effort to get our arms around the privacy and data use issues, data rights, data protection, from both the standpoint of privacy and cyber security as well. I think that this is the issue of our age, how data will be used and should not be used, how we're going to get the good benefits of all the amazing things happening through data. I've been reading a book I have really enjoyed called The Future is Faster Than You Think by Peter Diamandis. Reading it meaning while I'm running, I'm listening to it. And wow, it's a real eye-opener, even for someone like me who lives and breathes technology. So these things are coming fast. The government, it's not anybody's fault, but the government's not designed to keep up with change at this pace. We're going to have to reinvent those regulatory models, back to the need for sandboxes and tech sprints. But if I had to bet money, I don't think we're going to see a privacy agency enacted in the next year or 18 months now.
And I think it's also a bit.
I'm being reminded of that special episode of Breaking Banks that we did, because Europe has already told the United States that we really suck at keeping private data private. So Schrems too, and we have the fall of Privacy Shield and all of that. So what are your thoughts, Jace?
Well, it's creating a divide, right? That was actually one of my favorite episodes, the fall of the Privacy Shield, that we did, Dara, that we do need to get our act together. And, if you need any more proof, look at the recent infiltration of the US government and, where cyber sits. So we need a concerted effort to think about it from a regulatory point of view, to think about it from a consumer and customer benefit point of view, to think about it from a protection point of view, that it's all gotten so complex.
And apparently a national security point of view too.
Yeah. And a national
small tiny thing, but sorry to interrupt.
I mean, I don't know what you could possibly find if you got into, Treasury and Commerce's, databases, but I'm assuming it's pretty interesting. But, it's so complex. It does speak to the need to be more collaborative across oceans and even within the United States, that, if you think of, I don't know the quite correct medieval analogy of this, but the U.S. tends to, say, no, this is, our fiefdom. And then within the fiefdom of the United States, you've got, multiple federal fiefdoms, and then you've got state level fiefdoms, that it's a bit of a zoo.
Is it like our arrogant independence is that why we're so bad at this? Joann, why are we so bad at this?
I think there's some of that in it. I also think that we suffer from having so many regulatory agencies in the United States. It's a unique model. It kind of grew organically. I don't think hardly anyone would design it this way. If we were starting with a clean slate and the digital tools we have today, we wouldn't build what we have, but we have it. And it definitely slows us down. I talk to regulators in other parts of the world who want to reach out to the US with various kinds of initiatives. And they'll say, we don't know who to ask. There's not a central point for most of the things that people are working on, unless it's really a central bank issue that you're going to talk with the Fed about. And the problem with putting data privacy in the hands of one agency is obviously it's much bigger than finance, but it's everything. There's nothing that's not touched by it. So where do you draw those lines? Maybe
for a while, right? The FTC was our privacy, police, and that seemed to be the most the agency with the broadest sort of view of commerce, in the country. So that kind of made sense. So maybe it ends up there, but Joann, you're right. It's hard because the SEC has its little piece and FINRA has its little piece and the CFPB has its piece, and data privacy and security are an important part of every single one of these, regulatory oversight processes, but only like this. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like only for what they're looking at in their lanes because they can't, right? They can't go broader. That's not their job. And, they can't overstep what their authority is, but nobody is looking at it all together except now the states, right? California is looking at it all together. If you sit under NYDFS supervision, they're looking at it all together. And I'm wondering if those are, as much of a headache as honestly the state of California has caused for registering as a data broker and the CCPA, it's not a bad model. It's not a bad model to look at, and they borrowed the core concepts from Europe, which isn't a bad model to look at either. And I think maybe our federal our lawmaker, I shouldn't even say agencies, our lawmakers should be looking at that more closely, because even if we don't do it through a separate regulatory agency, we can do it through legislation, well-written, thoughtful legislation.
Well, and it takes one of two forms. We look at this and say, thoughtful regulation and interagency operability, modernization is a source of competitive advantage that allows us to solve a whole host of issues that we face around inclusion and discrimination, and just making sure that a major part of our population is keeping up and creating that access while simultaneously protecting them. Or we wait for something really, really bad to happen, and then we try and do it, at a shotgun marriage to try and clean it up, as fast as we can. All of some of the 2008 stuff, right?
I was gonna say, there's a playbook for that second option that you were talking about. We know how to do that.
Well, I was about to ask Joann this question when you were making that point, and I think it's even more relevant now. How bad of a thing has to happen before the U.S. would actually, undertake this? If it's not for the right reason, which is, to be competitive, to bring social justice. But you got the question out first, Dara, because I was just going through my head, I'm like, how bad would it have to be? I'm like, oh, really, really bad.
But hasn't it been really, really bad? And Joann, I'll let you answer, but half of Americans have had their data compromised already. Count on, 27 people's different hands, how many data breaches have been experienced. some of the largest financial institutions, in our country. The federal government's been hacked. We've had election interference. It's been really bad. I mean, I'm going to wait for someone to steal the nuke codes. I don't know. Joann, what do you think?
Yeah, in some ways, politically, and in terms of public opinion, it's the frog boiling phenomenon, the gradual water getting gradually hot and the frog not realizing until it's too late. But I do think the U.S. will have to deal with this. There's no doubt in my mind that over the coming years, we will have legislation and regulatory policy trying to sift down to the basic issues of, again, data rights, data limitations on how data can be used, especially in finance and in medicine and health. I also think that I hope that lawmakers and policymakers will realize that some of the policy problems that they're confronting may have technology solutions. There's this whole family of so-called privacy-enhancing technologies, PETs, homomorphic encryption, zero-knowledge proof, these methods of limiting the amount of data that gets exposed. If you're in a situation where you're trying to buy alcohol, the clerk doesn't really need all the information on your driver's license, and they don't even need your birthday. They just need to know yes or no, are you old enough to buy alcohol?
Sounds like a case of digital identity.
So digital identity, I think, is going to be a huge issue relating to the privacy issue. I think we're going to be really grappling with that over the next few years. Congress, I used to work for the U.S. Senate. I'm not criticizing them, but Congress has a tendency when there is a big crisis to reorganize to solve it. And that's not always, it's something that's concrete and, you can see it being done, but it may or may not really solve the problem. But we are going to have to grapple with solving these problems.
Well, we're nearing sort of the end of our time, and the three of us have packed a lot. Right? We've packed a lot in to this episode. So because I'm a nerd, I've been taking notes this whole time. So, because that's what I do. So I have a comprehensive list of the 5 things that we think are going to be hot from a regulatory perspective in 2021. If we're ready. 1, according to Joann, we've got crypto going mainstream. 2, reg tech. As they say in Zoolander, it's so hot right now. 3, we've got digital dollars and programmable money. 4, data privacy. 5, cybersecurity. All of that wrapped up in digital identity. Anything my wonderful guests would like to add to that list? That's plenty. There's plenty for us to do in 2021, I think.
I'm going to add the issues of racial and gender fairness, trying to deal with the problems of distribution of wealth and income, some of which is obviously beyond the reach of financial companies and financial regulation. But I think we're going to see a very, very big focus on that. And also on ethics. One topic we haven't touched on today is green finance. I think that is going to become a pretty hot issue this year and more so next year, including safety and soundness issues around lending to places that are at risk from climate change, and also things like the concentration of energy use for mining Bitcoin. There's a lot of environmental issues that are really coming to the fore, I think, as well.
Well, Jason, I think Joann just outlined a wonderful segment for Breaking Banks, don't you think?
Yes. We'll have to have the folks back from SP Global that have been doing a lot of great analysis around ESG and the impact on the financial sector.
Yeah, that would be good.
Well, awesome.
And one more thing. I think we're going to have breakthroughs on financial crime. The technology is getting good there.
Awesome. Good.
We're starting to make traction. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope all of my listeners have a very happy holiday, a happy new year. Stay safe, stay sane, and can't wait to talk with you all again in 2021.